So let me just introduce an outstanding panel. It's a great honor for me to be here. My name is Michael Wirtz. I work at the Center for American Progress and will be moderating this session. We will start with three very brief 5-minute interventions. Congressman Robert Wexler is the first one to speak today. He is the director of the Daniel Abrams Center for Middle East Peace and has been a long-standing member of the U.S. Congress, where he has served 7 terms. He was the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and also a member of the Middle East Subcommittee and one of the leading voices in Middle Eastern affairs in this town. Congressman Wexler also was an early supporter of Barack Obama when he considered running for president. He supported him in March of 2007. That was a fairly early stage to go out there and support a guy that not that many people knew about. And the congressman retired in 2010 to lead the center. The second speaker will be Rudy de Leon. He is the Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. He is a former senior U.S. Defense Department official. Rudy has also served on the Committee on Armed Services for a period of 8 years. And for 5 years, beginning in 2001, he was Senior Vice President for the Boeing Company. He has a 25-year government career that he concluded as Deputy Secretary of Defense, also a member of the Deputies Committees on National Security, and one of the leading voices in town on national security affairs. The third speaker is Gökhan Bakic. I'm very happy that you are part of this panel. Gökhan teaches at Silver University in Gaziantep. He's a faculty member at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and an acclaimed and recognized author. He has written interesting analytical pieces about the Arab world. The West recognized and most well-known book is Hybrid Sovereignty in the Arab World, where he undertakes an interpretation of what is happening in the region. And Gökhan will be the third speaker and provide a fairly unique southeastern Turkish perspective on what we are going to discuss here. The theme of our panel is the future of the U.S.-Turkey partnership, and I would ask Congressman Wexler to kick off the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege and pleasure for me to be here. I understand this is a very much an interactive engagement, and in that spirit, I'd like to maybe be a bit direct and provocative, if that's apt. More than a decade ago, I, along with 2 Republican colleagues in the House of Representatives, set out to start the Turkey caucus. And it wasn't just the usual endeavor in the House of Representatives. The purpose was, I thought, quite critical in that there was no other nation on this earth that is so important to the United States and yet at the same time oftentimes so misunderstood by policymakers. And in this case, less so in terms of, at that time, the Bush administration or the Clinton administration at the end and then the Bush administration, but more so in terms of the Congress. And what am I specifically referring to? And this is where hopefully I'll be direct. Number one, for all the people in this town, all the smart people in this town, who for the last 5 to 6 years have been writing articles essentially with the title, "Who Lost Turkey?" or "Turkey is Moving Eastward," I would at least hope they would stand up and say, well, maybe they were actually wrong, and that their calculation was an exaggeration, and actually maybe not an exaggeration, but a complete misunderstanding of the national interests of Turkey and how they, in fact, do, more often than not, align with the United States, but for very legitimate reasons, they don't necessarily agree or coincide with the tactics that America uses. Let me be specific. I was in Istanbul 2 weeks ago and listened very carefully to Prime Minister Erdogan make a speech about foreign policy. But the crux of it, the focus, was on Syria. And the truth of the matter is, if you didn't know who you were listening to, and you didn't know it was the Turkish language, it was a speech, by and large, most Americans would hope their president would give, in terms of a demand for democracy, a demand for respect for human rights, and, in many respects, bold action to follow it. Now, why do I point this out? Surely I'm fully understanding of the differences of opinion that the United States and Turkey have had with respect to, say, Iran's nuclear weapon program, and votes that were taken that were not at all agreed to in Washington. I understand all that. I also understand that at times the rhetoric that is employed by some of Turkey's leaders, particularly as it relates to America's close ally and Turkey's ally, Israel, is highly unhelpful. But having said that, when we look at the issues of the day, America is removing our troops completely from Iraq within weeks. And the future of Iraq, of course, will be determined by the Iraqi people, but the two nations that will likely have a great impact on the future of Iraq and will determine whether the effort of the United States, both in terms of military and treasure, is in vain in terms of putting Iraq on a stronger, more productive footing, is Iran and Turkey. Those will be the two outside influences, primary influences in Iraq. And I, for one, and I think all Americans would agree, I'll put my coins, I'll put my bet on Turkey's influence rather than Iran's, in terms of being more aligned with America's interests. As America reduces its footprint in Afghanistan, again, Turkey is increasing its footprint in Afghanistan. And again, in terms of influences on the future of Afghanistan, Turkey's interests are largely akin to America's interests. Some people argue that Prime Minister Erdogan's decision to host the radar system for NATO was simply just a trade-off, so that he could go about and do other things that maybe America doesn't necessarily agree with so much. I can't get into Prime Minister Erdogan's head. I'm not a mind reader. But the fact of the matter is the decision to host a radar system that will be employed as a part of the worldwide American missile defense system is a significant decision. A significant decision, yet again, anchoring Turkey firmly in the West. If we look at where Turkey ultimately wound up in Libya, totally with the interests of the United States of America. If we look at the speech or speeches that Prime Minister Erdogan, in fact, gave when he visited Egypt, and he talked about the importance of a secular governing society and separating, in effect, religion from government. And he did so, obviously, with the background and the intensity that he has in terms of the Turkish experience. I don't want to sound like a cheerleader. I really don't. And maybe I do for the first part. But there are extensions of what is happening in Turkey that rightfully causes pause and concern, not only in America, but in Turkey, too. Quite frankly, some of the most vociferous criticism I hear of the Turkish government is not from Americans. It's from members of the Turkish community here in America and also in Turkey. And they're concerned about what might be a tendency in terms of limitations on the freedom of press. And they're concerned about the creeping influence of additional aspects of religion in society. All legitimate debates that the Turkish people in a very vibrant democracy should have. But the ultimate analysis in terms of, I think, America's interest in the region, we may not always agree with Prime Minister Erdogan and his government. The economic success of the government is extraordinary. But what I think we can count on is that Turkey will exhibit its newfound prominence in a way that, unlike many other nations in the region, while it may not always agree with the United States, I think I'm confident there is a genuine attempt to coalesce with the United States, particularly when Turkey's interests, by and large, align with the United States. And I would go one step further, and I will stop with this. Even when we may differ, the United States and Turkey, in terms of our ultimate interests, or even if our interests are in fact aligned, but the tactics and the reasons are very different, I would argue that it's in America's interest to work very closely with Prime Minister Erdogan, because for a variety of reasons, in many respects, he is, in fact, our most effective ally in terms of advocacy in the region that we have at this point. And who better than Prime Minister Erdogan, quite frankly, to align ourselves with in terms of influencing the events that are occurring in the Arab world. Now, I don't think either we or the Turks should exaggerate either American influence or Turkish influence on these events. These are particular events to Egypt, to Tunisia, to Morocco, to Syria, whatever it may be. But in terms of America's ability to influence events, I come down strongly on the side of understanding that if we are aligned with Turkey in many of these circumstances, our ability to influence events in ways that are most productive and positive to America are significantly enhanced if we do it aligned with Turkey rather than separated or unaffiliated with Turkey. And one last very quick thing. If anyone in this room, regardless of how you feel about the flotilla, regardless of how you feel about Israel's policy relative to the West Bank or to Gaza, if anyone in this room believes that the, at times, inflammatory nature of the manner in which the Turkish government has engaged with Israel helps Turkey, I would respectfully differ in the strongest of terms. That doesn't mean that Turkey should not represent its own interests strongly with great advocacy, but to divide Turkey and Israel in the context of what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa now doesn't serve Turkey's interests, doesn't serve Israel's interests, and it surely doesn't serve America's.
Thank you very much, Congressman Woody. You've been in the business for 30 years, and Turkey has always been an important member of NATO. Please give us your perspective.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you to all of the participants here and for the invitation to speak. Try to lower my volume there a little. So, I've just come from, I'm on the Defense Policy Board. No, you put it too close. So I've just come from the Defense Policy Board, where we've met with Secretary Panetta these last 2 days as he prepares to work with Congress and puts together a defense budget at one level, $450 billion in cuts across 12 years, and then deals with the volatility of sequestration in the Congress not being able to do the big budget deal that the super committee was created to do. But it's interesting in terms of the categories of issues that we talked about the last 2 days. China and the Pacific, no surprise there. The role of NATO as the Europeans deal with significant budget reductions and the lack of resources for their own defense, let alone supporting NATO on NATO exercises. Discussion of Russia and nuclear weapons and what is the path forward to create more stability to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And then the fourth category was a new terminology, the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't the Middle East, it wasn't Iran, it was the Eastern Mediterranean, of which Turkey is obviously a critical country, a critical player, both as one of the largest members of NATO, also with a surging economy, and also with its repositioning in the region to create its own leverage as it looks to the Islamic world and steps forward to offer its vision for the region, both economically, politically, diplomatically. So it's a big change. If we were meeting 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't have identified Turkey as one of the critical players. I think a lot of this is to the current administration in the government in terms of how they have repositioned themselves. I think you talk to Americans who have recently visited Turkey, and they are less likely to engage on political issues, and they are instead likely to come back and talk about the vigorousness and the vitality of the Turkish economy and the role that it plays at a time when Europe is down and the Americans are struggling. The Turks have a business model that is working very well with them, and having a surplus in the bank is something that provides additional leverage and makes your voice louder to hear. So, we begin with talking about Turkey's importance in the region. Now, it's been a secular democracy. That's been one of its strengths. The politics are changing somewhat. Washington has gotten through 2 years of recalibrating its dialogue, where the military-to-military channel was always one of the most significant in terms of ideas and exchange back and forth. So it is now becoming more traditional, where the constitutional civilian government is exercising more authority over the command and control of the military. That's certainly consistent with Western values. There is a strong legacy of rule of law. There's been a sustained engagement. It's interesting that President Obama's first trip was not to France or to Germany or to Britain. It was to Turkey, as a recognition of Turkey's geopolitical status in the region. So this is a period where Turkey as a country, as a government, as a political group, is seeing their leverage and their authority on the rise, very much so. So the challenge is how to use this increasing power and responsibility, how to use it economically. I think everyone wants to have a trading relationship with Turkey right now. That's as good as a gold standard right now in terms of the economy. In terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey still will play and is expected to play a key role in NATO. That's important for stability in a number of areas. But then, looking toward the Middle East, what role can they play? They have been big on calling out problems when problems needed to be called out. So they were there as Egypt went through the Arab Spring, and they talked about the need for a succession and for democratic rule in Egypt. In Syria, as a humanitarian crisis was going on, let alone a diplomatic and political crisis, they stepped forward, their prime minister, to urge restraint and then to urge change on the part of Assad and the Syrian government. And so that's using their political clout in a way that leverages in a highly constructive way. And so that's being recognized and noticed. I do think that they have made their point on the Gaza flotilla. There are certainly issues where both sides would benefit. The Israelis and the Turks would benefit from talking and getting together and working that through. Right now, the politics of each sort of prevent that from happening. But Turkey, as a historic moderator and being a moderate perspective in the Middle East, with their relationship with their Islamic neighbors as well as Israel, that has been a huge resource for the West, and that has been a great strength of the government of Turkey historically. And so I think both sides, both the Israelis and the Turks, have made their points. I'm not sure that another round of arguing over who needs to step forward first to try to reconcile with the other will be constructive. But putting that issue in perspective and looking forward in terms of Turkey's role with Israel will be very important. Never underestimate the goodwill that Turkey has generated with the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives in particular, because of the moderating role that they have played historically in the Middle East. There has been a strong element of affiliation in the House of Representatives with Turkey, particularly on the question of whether the resolution on Armenia should come to a vote. There are arguments on both sides, but there has been a reservoir of goodwill toward Turkey in the U.S. House of Representatives, largely rooted in the constructive role that Turkey has played in the Middle East with NATO as a friend of the United States. And so that issue is very critical. And then I think, obviously, we're watching very carefully the history of being a secular government has well served, I think, part of the reason for the rise of Turkey right now. And so looking at how the party structure moves forward, how the civilians take further responsibility for executive decisions, very critical as we move forward. Afghanistan. Turkey's played a critical role for the United States, and the United States needs its friends and partners right now in Afghanistan as it starts the process of the turnover in Afghanistan and an exit, at least in terms of the current military stage of activities in 2014. Iraq was a 3-year exit based on the status of force agreement that was negotiated in December of 2008, right after the election, but before the inauguration. And so very shortly, and by shortly I mean in just a few days, the U.S. military mission in Iraq will be over. And so I think we salute President Obama for his leadership there. And the U.S. will continue its repositioning, bringing most of the troops home, but returning to a limited number of troops elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula as part of its deployment. I don't want to go too long because I really want to let the other speakers talk and then come back to your questions. I think the key will be moving forward and Turkey staying on a constant path as the Americans go through the presidential election in 2012. I worked for President Clinton for eight years. These debates are hard to watch sometimes, just in terms of the level of rhetoric that comes out and the retreat to unilateralism, things like that. So the Americans will be preoccupied in 2012 with its political process, with its elections, the need to create jobs. We hope that our friends in Turkey, as they go through this period of great economic success, will have a few lessons learned that they can share with their friends in the United States, because we could certainly benefit on constructive ideas on jobs creation here in the United States. But I think this is a time where Turkey is on the rise. They are a very dynamic country, and their constructive role in leadership is something that I think the United States will welcome very much. And with that, Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Gökhan, I'd like you to share your thoughts about what you just heard, and also maybe include a few ideas of what you think is the perspective of the Turkish government towards the United States, and what strategies are in place to make this partnership even stronger.
Thank you, Michael. Well, frankly speaking, not only what I heard in this panel, a quick analysis of what is being written and said about Turkish-American relations, everything is perfect. But I should ask why? Because of some kind of economic relations, or this Arab Spring effect? Just imagine 6 or 8 months ago, despite member of NATO, Chinese jets were in Turkey for a military exercise, and Turkish government stopped Israeli participation. And for having Chinese jets in Turkey for a military exercise, the US government did not permit the use of joint-made F-16s. So what changed in this story? The change is the Arab Spring for both sides. For Turkey, when we look at the east, we recognize the Iranian threat. We recognize that Syria had Russian-made missiles. Tartus is the center of Russian military, is a kind of military basis. And on the other hand, the second point is NATO. Well, Turkish people, we are proud of being candidate to European Union, but historically speaking, not European Union candidacy, but NATO membership is the most important institutional aspect of Turkey's membership to the Western Club, not European Union. So NATO has been always important in Turkey. We act in Serbia with the states together in Serbia. We were together in Libya, in Afghanistan. So also imagine that 15 years ago, Poland was part of 20 years ago Russian system. Now it's buying all weapons from the States, and in the expansion of NATO, Turkey played a very, very critical role. So NATO is very, very critical in analyzing Turkish policy. But on the other hand, through NATO, Turkey gets the ability of taking a high profile in Libya, so on and so forth. But the second question, everything is perfect, but because of the Arab Spring. So I'm not sure if the Arab Spring is going to bring democracy back. It's very successful in bringing foreign allies together again, Turkey and America, so dancing, singing together with NATO, it's okay. But the question is it a long-term reality? The answer is definitely no. Just after normalization, Turkey is gonna again knock the door of Iran because of energy. Let me give you some numbers. After 50 years of strategic partnership, the trade volume between Turkey and America is less than $50 billion. Just imagine American economy is 50 trillion. In 1999, Turkish-Chinese trade volume was less than 1 billion. Right now it's almost 30 billion. So is it sustainable? Do you believe that a growing economy just keeping Turkey in this route with little numbers? So in the end, the critical point is when people are talking about strategy, of course the American-Turkish alliance does make sense. But in the long term, the key word is economy. So how to, change this traditional, let's say, vicious circle? This is very, very critical. On the other hand, I should say another important point on this role of economy. Turkey is a zone broker country. This is very critical, which means that if you analyze Turkish foreign policy since 1950s, Turkey said that I am part of NATO, but I am the actor that is going to connect NATO and the rest. I am part of West, but Turkey is the actor to connect West and the rest. Just imagine these binaries of Turkish foreign policy. Just imagine the Turkish role between Iran and America. So, which means that when Turkey faces that there is a kind of competition in different poles, immediately is going to act as a zone broker. My expectation, Turkey wants to play a zone broker role between China and the US in the long-term strategy. Imagine Turkey and Russia were enemies officially during the Cold War. There is no visa between Turkey and Russia right now. But just imagine how it is difficult for Turks to go to Europe, sometimes America, sometimes it's humiliation. So how to keep Turkey on this route while there are many opportunities for middle-class, middle-sized companies to invest China, to invest Russia, because it's just like visiting another Turkish city. So let me summarize. Right now everything is okay because of strategy. Strategy is about political elites. It's about Mr. Erdogan, it's about Davutoğlu, it's about American elites. But in the long term, I think the main actors are the market actors. Of course, political elites are important. So in the long term, again, Turkey will gonna substitute strategy. So I can summarize, there is a spirit, but let's talk about the flesh, the soul and flesh, about American-Turkish relations. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give Congressman Wexler and Rudy de Leon an opportunity to briefly react, but would also like to connect this with a question. Congressman, you have talked about the Israeli-Turkish relationship. If you were asked to give us, in a very abbreviated way, the worst-case scenario and the best-case scenario from a U.S. perspective, how that Turkish-Israeli disagreement plays out, what would that be?
Well, the best-case scenario would be that the Israeli leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Peres, were able to agree with Prime Minister Erdogan, President Gül possibly, to a formula that satisfied both the Israeli and the Turkish interests. A formula of some type of apology, a formula of compensation, and then an agreement as to the steps the Turkish government would take immediately thereafter to begin the rehabilitation of the relationship. My understanding, somewhat following very thoughtful remarks, is that while Israeli-Turkish political relations, of course, are at a deep low, the economic relationship, ironically, between Turkey and Israel still, while not as possibly robust in certain sectors as it was, and certainly tourism has dropped, the economic relationship still is relatively strong considering the political divide that exists. So that's the positive side. The negative side would be that on either side of the equation, the political leaders ignore their responsibility to be sober in difficult times, and they ratchet up the division, either by language or by action. And then there could be an event, possibly an unforeseen event, that then brings Israel and Turkey into a greater level of confrontation. And that would be just disastrous for both sides and the United States as well. And what I find most troubling, I was just interacting with Defense Minister Ehud Barak in Israel, who completely respects and appreciates the degree of cooperation between Israel and Turkey and the value of it. But in just talking with him, think about what's occurring in Syria today. And the dramatic change that is likely to occur in Syria over the next 3-6 months. And the notion that Israel and Turkey are not coordinating, talking, working, coalescing around a joint strategy with respect to Syria is absurd. Absurd both from a Turkish and Israeli perspective. And that's just one example of why the division between Turkey and Israel serves no one's purposes. And I say this, I do not minimize in any way the emotional and legitimate impact on the Turkish people of 9 people being killed on international waters. I understand that. I also understand that for a period of time, the objective truth was that the response of the Turkish government was a moderate, sober response. And I think respectfully, or I had hoped respectfully, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government would have taken the opportunities that they had to offer the type of apology and compensation that seemed to have been negotiated. And the comments of the Israeli foreign minister, for instance, are not helpful. On the other hand, if you look at some of the interviews that Prime Minister Erdogan gave while he was in New York, and again I say this with great respect, some of the things he said are totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. There were exaggerations of extraordinary degree of the amount of death in Gaza caused by Israelis. That is not true. It's not helpful. And some of the language, and I, again, respect Prime Minister Erdogan greatly, but when we talk about sensitive subjects, and certainly Turkey and its elected officials understand sensitive subjects, there are certain words that are employed that make other people highly sensitized. And Prime Minister Erdogan has used some of those words that cause great concern on the Israeli side. And while I agree with Rudy that there is a significant respect in the House of Representatives and Congress for America's relationship with Turkey, there are people in this room that know very well, 2 are sitting right over here, that there are domestic forces in the United States, whether it be the historical conflict between Greece and Turkey, Armenia and Turkey, and one of the avenues of support for the American-Turkish relationship, quite frankly, was the American Jewish community. And today, there is great angst in the American Jewish community as a result of this divide, and particularly as a result of the inflammatory language. That helps no one.
Thank you very much. Rudy, you have mentioned that the U.S.-Turkish relationship became more complex. It moved from a very strong relationship into a new phase, so to speak. This has been a learning experience from a U.S. perspective. So my question is, A, how are we doing in that learning curve to develop more complex relationships with partners that are emerging and sometimes moving more quickly than the foreign and defense policy establishment might be used to? And secondly, do you think we are on a good trajectory to address the issues that Gökhan has pointed out, the longer-term draft that might exist towards China, towards Russia, to make sure that the Turkish-U.S. relationship stays on track?
Well, good place to start. And to Congressman Wexler, you're right. The reason that I brought up the level of support in the House of Representatives for Turkey was that was based upon their policy of moderation and strategic engagement with Israel. And so if that relationship deteriorates, then you'll see it manifested in a much more turbulent role in the House of Representatives, and that would help no one. But that's certainly a distinct possibility. Let me take the broader question. Relations with Turkey are upbeat. They're good right now. And you're right, we're in a period where with, that Eastern Mediterranean being a hot spot of the Arab Spring and diplomatic, the rest of the world is largely focused on trade and economics. Now, several of us at the Center for American Progress, long before sort of this new phase where Turkey is really cool and, interesting, in 2007, 2008, we did a big report on Turkey. We needed to restore the strategic relationship between the United States and Turkey because it had gotten frayed during the build-up to the Second War in Iraq, 2003, as contrasted to 1991, where Turkey was a very critical part of the global coalition to push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, as compared to the Bosnian peacekeeping campaign, where Turkey played a critical role as the bridge between the Russian forces that came in and did part of the peacekeeping at a time when Russia was down economically and when it was really struggling in its new phase. As a NATO member, the Turks played a critical role in helping Russia get in the game, even to the point where NATO went to Reebok to get sort of casual uniforms for the Russian soldiers to wear in their off hours because they didn't have any pocket money, things like that. But for the rest of the world, this is an economic time. China, we're just back from a visit to China. We went to Chongqing, 1,000 miles to the west on the Yangtze River. And there are very interesting things going on in western China, which include the construction of a rail line from western China to Europe that will deliver more product. It will be the equivalent of the container ships that leave the Pacific ports of China and make their way to the port of Long Beach in California, which is now the largest port for receiving cargo containers. So, a direct rail line from western China to Europe will certainly be a vigorous test of can trade remain balanced as the manufacturing engines of China turn on in new areas. But one of the challenges for China is can they generate more of their economic growth through domestic consumption and move away from an export-only strategy, because you're interested in China as a partner for your imports. Just as the United States continues to do high-end exports to China, and in turn, Walmart and others. So balancing trade will become as critical and challenging in this next decade as was balancing the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century, or in the immediate term, dealing with the hotspots of the Eastern Mediterranean in terms of slowing down and hopefully preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons elsewhere into the Middle East, figuring out how to support democracy in Egypt. Egypt is the oldest country. It's one of the cradles of all of our civilizations, the most historic legacy country in the Middle East. And so as it goes through this period of democratic institutions, but needing to copy Turkey, because what Egypt needs most is economic reform. And it needs most how to create jobs for young people, and young people with educations and young people who are struggling to get educations. That is the challenge facing Europe, facing Egypt, and that's where a partner like Turkey will be very, very critical. The other thing is that just as the European and the American financial recoveries are very slow and in progress, the Arab Spring is not going to be a one-year process. It's going to be a 5-year process or longer, and that's going to require partnerships and coalitions. And so Turkey is up because they're playing a critical role, because they've got resources, because they've developed a model that works very well for them. As you know, we're in this new period of the 21st century where it's a global economy. The Cold War is 20 years in the past, and basically, folks are trying to figure out what the economic models are.
Look, I'd like to give you the opportunity to briefly respond, and also I'll rephrase my question that I had directed toward into your direction before. If you sat with Prime Minister Erdogan and he had heard what you said in your introductory statement, and he would say, Gökhan, you make me really nervous, what should I do about securing longer-term U.S.-Turkish relationship? What would your answer be?
Well, thanks to God, he has never listened to me, okay? So I have no connection, okay? Well, yeah, on the one hand, strategy is critical. NATO is still very, and will be very critical for Turkey. Mm-hmm. So I can't say that there's a major alternative in front of Turkey, to substitute this, security aspect of Turkish foreign policy or global stance. But let's get a more detail of what's happening in Turkey in the last 10 years. New social coalitions, new economic formations. The new emerging market actors are oppressing government to form strategic relationship between Turkey and America. Again, historically speaking, itself Turkey's democracy came out because of Truman Project in late 1940s. It was nothing. I did say anything that made Turkish elites unhappy. So there's nothing problem about strategic aspect. But the Imam, our salaries are very low. And Khomeini said that we did not this revolution because of the price of melons. It's these supra values. But right now, it is not surprising to expect that these secular concerns are going to shape Middle Eastern politics. Mm-hmm. So I think we need a new kind of balance between economy and strategy.
Your question or your intervention to one of the panelists, and to be brief. You are first, sir, and then Josh Walker. Please.
Idris Bal, member of Turkish Parliament and professor of international relations, suggested that we should stabilize these relations, and it was Arab Spring, energy, Central Asia, Balkans, Europe. On the other hand, we have different approaches and policies regarding Iran, Iraq, Cyprus, Israel, Armenian issues. But in general, we can say, and understanding these handicaps, it will be too difficult to stabilize our relations. So what is your suggestions? How should we approach these issues and handicaps so that we will be able to stabilize our relations?
Talked a lot about turmoil in the Middle East and elections, but what about the most important election in this town, which is a year away? As we watch the Republican candidate.
The expert on that issue, if you would please.
Thank you very much. I think the question with regard to the handicaps and how should they be addressed was directed to you, Rudy. If you'd like to chime in on 2012, you are more welcome to do this, and then we'll move on to the congressman.
Okay. Well, In terms of the Turkish-American agenda, in many respects, we'll find our solutions and our common ground in how well both of us can contribute to the Eastern Mediterranean, Arabian Peninsula in terms of solutions. You're right, Cyprus, the Gaza flotilla, Iran are political policy issues that are there, and they're important. The spread of nuclear weapons remains the single gravest threat that is out there. But the longer term, it's how a regional approach we can help reconstruct the economic development throughout the region, in Egypt in particular. Egypt doesn't have oil, so it's not like one of the Gulf countries where the governmental structures all center around inherent natural resource wealth. So Egypt, the U.S., Turkey, NATO, all will have a significant interest in seeing Egypt turn out to be a prosperous, multicultural democracy. And that's going to be easier to talk about than it is actually to do, because the undercurrents are not political inequities, that's part of it, but the real inequities are the lack of an economic future for so many, and creating economic opportunity is very challenging. So I think that will be as important a test to the relationship as NATO was to the Cold War in decades past. So I think that will test us very much. Some of the issues, in the 90s, I was the Undersecretary of the Air Force, and so negotiated the agreement with between the United States and Turkey on the Incirlik Air Base. Interestingly, at the time, the biggest issues were the number of Turkish citizens that we would guarantee employment at the bases. So the relationship has moved dramatically beyond to strategic partnership on critical issues. Cyprus, I first crossed the Green Line in Cyprus in 1987, and so I'm not sure that we've made a lot of progress since then. I think the famous Greek lobby is not what it used to be. Maybe Rob knows better, but I think there's an opportunity to start fresh in Cyprus and to turn one of those pages that has been an irritant and look for a solution that works there. But then Iranian nukes, that's going to be just a huge issue, because the potential to destabilize. So if Iran gets a nuke, Turkey's going to need a nuke, Saudi Arabia is going to need a nuke, the United Arab Emirates are going to need a nuke. And then, so that's 4 new countries with nuclear weapons. You've got to make sure that the command and control for those weapons is secure. You've got to make sure that there are lock and key checks so that the bona fide National Command Authority is the only entity that has authority over those weapons. So if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it will create pressure for several other countries in the region to get nuclear weapons. And that will create a whole new set of challenges.
Congressman.
Well, with respect to the third question, and then maybe the second, help or hurt, and help or derail. I think the truth of the matter is the Middle East peace process was derailed by a whole number of factors that have little or nothing to do with the Gaza flotilla. That's not to minimize the impact of the flotilla in the region. It was significant. But I don't think the reason why we have not yet seen the progress that many of us had hoped we would see in terms of the Israelis and the Palestinians is because of the Gaza flotilla. I would analyze this in a couple of different ways. I didn't quite frankly understand the reaction fully of the Turkish government when Prime Minister Netanyahu actually changed his policy with respect to Gaza, and in fact opened up to a degree, a large degree, the amount of resources and material that was permitted to go into Gaza subsequent to the flotilla. In one of my visits to Turkey, I asked the leading officials, why didn't Prime Minister Erdogan declare victory? In fact, he made this extraordinarily public demand upon the Israeli government to break the Gaza blockade. And yes, the Israelis still maintain the blockade in terms of shipments coming from abroad and so forth, but the amount of material, and now recently even cement, being allowed into Gaza is quite extraordinary. Now, I'm sure my friends in Israel would not say, we did it because of Erdogan. They're not going to say that, I imagine. But the truth of the matter is, if you follow the events in chronological order resulted in a significant change in Israeli policy, and it would not be irrational or illogical to conclude that the actions that Turkey took, and I'm not endorsing them, but the actions that Turkey took actually had a certain desired effect from the Turkish perspective. But yet no one in Turkey took credit. No one in Turkey actually declared victory, understanding because they didn't get the response they wanted in terms of an apology and compensation. But if you analyze it from a unemotional, somewhat detached point of view, the Turkish effort was successful. My contrary argument would be that in certain respects Turkey, in its overall approach, has not helped the peace process because Turkey tends to, or has tended to, focus on the Hamas portion. And Turkey's criticism often of the United States is either our inability or unwillingness to deal directly with Hamas, and they question whether we read it all wrong in terms of the fact that we view Hamas as a terrorist organization. But I would argue that either the intended or unintended consequence of some of Turkey's approach is to actually undermine the forces within the Palestinian society that in fact support the peace efforts. And let us be candid, Hamas rejects, they are a rejectionist group in terms of the peace process that both the United States, Turkey, our European allies, and the Quartet support. But it's Fatah and President Abbas, of course, that has placed his entire political effort in this regard, and Turkey's policies at times, I would argue, undermine the very moderate element amongst the Palestinian society, and in that respect, I would say Turkey's overall effort may not be as helpful as it might otherwise be. But I think we shouldn't forget that America and Turkey's policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is actually, at its core, not all that different. What do we support? What did the President say in May? We support, as the basis of negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that the boundaries be resolved based on the 1967 lines with agreed territorial swaps. And the President went on to talk about the need for providing significant security, both to the Israelis and, of course, the Palestinians. And when you get down deeper in terms of not necessarily the publicly stated positions, but the manner in which America would envision that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be resolved is highly consistent with the Turkish vision. So while the tactics may be different, I would say the ultimate conclusion is very similar. As to the American election, as to the U.S.-Turkish relationship, I would not foresee a dramatic difference, whether it's President Obama or President Gingrich or President Romney or whomever it is. But I think there would potentially be a dramatic difference in the manner in which a President Obama versus one of his Republican opponents might frame some of these issues in terms of how America will engage with the region. And that could have, I think, significant effects. And the somewhat dogmatic way, and Rudy referred to this, I don't think this is unique to the Republican Party. The Democratic Party does the same thing when we have contested primaries. But the dogmatic way in which candidates tend to express themselves during a contested primary is not necessarily the manner in which they would express themselves at a general election, or if they were to then be elected and govern. And to me, the greatest concern in this regard, from what I see thus far of the Republican candidates, would be an inclination to see things in black and white terms when in fact they are quite gray. And particularly with Turkey, my humble experience tells me that most times it is not black and white. There is a shade of gray, and there's a nuance that the President of the United States must fully appreciate if we're going to engage with Turkey in a constructive way.
Thank you very much. I have
Sinanji, the issue of strategy that you've all been talking about, specifically with respect to the question of troop withdrawal from Iraq and the likely coordination of policies between the United States and Turkey with once the troops do pull out. This has to be one of the most critical things that foreign policymakers are making now. Is there a coordinated strategy as to what could happen once US troops pull out in the event that the territorial integrity of Iraq is under duress? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third gentleman is here.
Kind of economic interests to be balanced with that. I'm interested in getting suggestions of the economic partnership and the strategic partnership together. I'd be interested in hearing those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gökhan, why don't I ask you to address the last question?
Well, we all know that Taliban is ruling Iraq, let's say, quote unquote, for some years, but it's not typical democracy, but just international system. All Kurdish groups in northern Iraq are happy of Barzani, but to a large extent, we don't expect a surprise in northern Iraq about a serious radical change of status quo. But talking about how to rule Iraq and also how to reintegrate Shia people to the Iraqi system, I don't think there's a common or joint strategy between the US and Turkey. This is quite a difficult question. It's a $1 million question. I wish I know the exact answer, but let me give some ideas. The first is, well, right now, when we analyze the general profile of Turkish economy, the most employment-producing actors are middle-sized companies. So I think a more focus on these sectors or these sectors might make sense, because these are also creating long-term sociological effects, which means that in the last 50 years, public diplomacy has been critical in Turkish-American relations. I mean, why people are still skeptical about America, including in Turkey, but not on China. China is a communist country. Because trade may change people's ideas. If you keep working through middle-sized companies, they have an employment-creating effect, which may change also people's ideas about America in a more positive way. So I think...
In return, their telephone never rang. They did not get a call back. Second, pretty clear that the Ayatollahs and Ahmadinejad do not see the world the same. Underlying, they probably view an Iranian nuclear program as an element of national sovereignty, not doing it as he was flying off to the United Nations. So the Iranian nuclear problem will remain a regional problem, and so I would think that it's a problem for Turkey, for Saudi Arabia, for the United Arab Emirates, for all of the partners there. And so again, a regional approach will be very critical, and maintaining that. I think the Obama administration has tried to go down the path of sanctions, tried to use the United Nations. The IAEA recently validated much of the logic of that. On Iraq, I think that the United States and Turkey will return to the position that it had prior to the 2003 war, and much like the post-1991. There will be one of the first tests of Iraq will be how well does the Kurdish minority, how well are they respected in Iraq? And what we know is that when Saddam Hussein would move against the Kurds, it would force a humanitarian migration toward Turkey. Take that and complexify it by the PKK And that's an issue of Turkish sovereignty and also their own rule of law and law enforcement and anti-terrorism. So I think that in terms of the U.S. and Turkey, the next phase, it's not announced as a policy, but with U.S. and Turkish forces in Turkey regularly interacting with each other. One of the things I hope the Obama administration has created was an opportunity to move beyond the rather unilateral Washington initiatives of 2002 and 2003.
Congressman, Rudy has laid out the strategic and the political context of Iraq and Iran questions. How is this going to play out in an election year in the United States? Iran is already an issue. Do you see Iraq, the redeployment and the integrity of the country playing a role, and how could that affect the issues that we're discussing here?
Of course it'll play a role, but the American election will revolve itself around American jobs, the American economy, and more jobs and more economy, and more jobs and more economy. There will be side debates about Iran. There will be side debates about Iraq, surely, assuming there are no catastrophic events that focus people's attention. But Ohio will be determined on jobs. Pennsylvania will be determined on jobs. Florida will be determined on jobs. And President Obama and his Republican opponent are going to be focused on that. In terms of long-term strategic objectives, I would offer two quick observations. That we shouldn't be paralyzed by the short-term analysis, as justified as it is. Number one, I don't think the last chapter actually has even begun to be written in terms of Turkey's relationship with the European Union. And when the European Union, assuming it does, irons out its current extraordinary problems, I suspect when that is done, not too long after, there will be some very thoughtful people in Berlin and in Paris and in other parts of Europe that say, maybe we didn't actually calculate the manner in which we engaged with Turkey in a way that was so much in our interest. And given our predicament versus Turkey's rise, maybe we ought to revisit this thing. Likewise, in Ankara, after the Turkish leaders get done smarting about how well their fortune is relative to the misfortune in Europe, Turkish leaders may begin to calculate, there may be an opportunity here. Europe's in a bit of a less advantageous situation. Maybe we, in fact, can create a relationship that is more advantageous to Turkey. This, I think, is a place where America can play a particularly useful role. I wouldn't put American-Turkish trade relations in a zero-sum analysis. I think the world is far more global than that. And I think America's most important role, potentially in terms of the economy, will be to be the, granted not vested party, but the extremely interested, hopefully persuasive party in continuing to engage Turkey with Europe in an economic way. And that, I would argue, directly impacts the Turkish-American relationship in a very favorable way. And one other thing, with respect to Iran, if we have learned anything yet from the experiences in North Africa and the Middle East, is that just when we think a certain area might, for a variety of reasons, be immune to what is happening, we learn, oh well, no, they're not immune. I remember very distinctly an interview that President Bashar Assad gave defining why Syria was calm. And it was because he wasn't allied with the United States. He wasn't allied in terms of a more cooperative policy towards Israel. Well, when Bashar Assad finally leaves the scene, either voluntarily or through an end similar to Gaddafi, I have full confidence, not necessarily the next day, but Iran also will not be immune to the circumstances that are inflicting the region and or the opportunities. And again, Turkey will have an extraordinary role to play, both economically, strategically, politically, militarily, everything, in terms of the events that unfold in Iran. And it was a really interesting book, and I'm not the scholar here, that was I saw about a year and a half ago, and I read most of it, about the true natural allies in the region based on the histories of the people, are actually the United States, Iran, and Turkey. And I actually believe I'm confident the events we're seeing will, not in 6 months. But in a long-term strategic scenario, it's highly, I think, predictable that once again Iran will be a more responsible nation, more aligned economically and otherwise with a group of responsible nations, and Turkey will be central to that process.
Thank you very much. We'll take one last question. The gentleman here at the second row, please.
We've had a lot
There's a microphone.
We've had a lot of talk about economic being a big part of the solution and greater trade, and I'm very concerned with 1/10 the amount of trade happening with America as with Europe, 1/2 of that happening with China. What are the solutions for us to have a more vibrant economic relationship in order to underpin a lot of the things we've been talking about on?
Gurkhan, would you?
Well, very frankly speaking,
also let me also, since this is going to be the last round, let me invite all three of you to speculate. We're in 2011 now. Where do you see the Eastern Mediterranean and U.S. and Turkey in 2020?
well, very frankly speaking, I'm a political scientist, so I can describe the economic issues, but I cannot, give the exact answers. Maybe the following up sessions, there will be some people who are much interested in economic aspect and the right policy. Just speaking for my behalf, not the panel, is to ask direct question to the second. Turning back to the second point, well, I think on Iran, just talking about what may happen, Turkey's policy is changing seriously. Just remember last year, Turkish leaders, the Turkey, Brazil, Iran, but it's not like that time right now. Just after the last report, Turkey said that Turkey is not very serious to jump in the case. So Turkey is becoming more realistic on Iran because to the point, Iran with nuclear ability is not in favor of Turkey. It is a direct threat to Turkey. I just remind you, there was an Iranian general who said that we can hit Turkey if any facility of NATO is going to be used through Turkish territory. So, of course, I'm not saying this simple general is to represent all Iranian mentality. I hope there are some responsible people in Tehran, but this is something we should put somewhere. So the second is, again, through Arab Spring, we recognize that Iran and Turkey are competing in different areas. In Bahrain, Turkey is not speaking like about Syria. We never say that in Bahrain, Shia people are majority, let them rule Bahrain. We don't say that. I mean, we support the Sunni minority against the Shia majority with the US, with our ally. So on Iran, I think Turkey is becoming much more realistic, but there's a hurdle here. Despite this realization is taking place, how to overcome energy problem? Gas. Turkey is buying 75% of its energy, which means almost $50 billion a year, which means that dependency on Russia and Iran. There is no other way. Let's see what's going to happen in Libya. They are not sure. So on Iran, it's, I think, point. But I just want to back to Joshua's question. I think this point, yes, it's correct. I mean, the U.S. is a great state. There is a kind of continuity in foreign policy. But I think right now we can talk about personal level relationship. I should say that there is a perfect harmony between Turkish Prime Minister and President Obama. Looking at the candidates of Republican Party, I can't guarantee the same level may repeat with a possible. I'm not saying that America is not going to change radically everything, but I'm not sure that any Republican president will repeat this level of personal harmony with President Obama, Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and President Obama. So I think this Republican issue is and will be quite serious point to make some expectations about the future of Turkish-American relations.
Thank you. Congressman.
2020, we will have seen a dramatic, tumultuous time in the Arab nations. Most, if not all, will have been largely affected by it. Hopefully by 2020, there will be some opportunity for sober planning for the future as opposed to battling between disparate parts between the nations. And comes 2020, hopefully the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have been resolved in some satisfactory way, and there will be the ability for most, if not all, of the parties of the region to begin to think like a region, to implement a regional economic strategy, which is totally non-existent today. And in that capacity, Turkey, again, will have this extraordinary role to play, talk about being a bridge between China and the United States, which I think is exaggerated, or even between Europe and the Middle East in a political sense. A bridge between Europe and a redefined North Africa and Middle East in an economic sense could make Turkey even far more prominent than it is today.
Thank you. Rudy, you have the last word.
Well, 2020. First, my colleagues have remarked on their trips to Turkey, the recent, how many American corporate logos they're seeing in Turkey. So I think that reflects the growing trade relationship. By 2020, it's quite possible that the Chinese economic growth strategy will have peaked. Growing at 8% per year and continuing to move up the technology value chain, they are hitting on all cylinders. They are very vigorous. There will reach a point where the growth model will not be sustainable in the way that it is right now. And so that will, I think, rebalance historic trading relationships between Turkey and Europe, between the United States and Europe, between the United States and Turkey, with perhaps a growing prosperity in Africa because of Africa's importance given their natural resources. So they will, if they can get better governance in Africa, they certainly have the capacity to generate capital for their own economic development. One of the problems of some of the oil companies, Michael's doing a study on them right now, of Niger, it's generating tremendous amount of oil revenue, but none of it's going into the economic model of the country. And it's got a population growth rate that sees the median age continuing to get younger and younger. So, by 2012, the economics of the global marketplace will maybe be slowing down and starting to change. And then, energy as potentially new supplies of natural gas come from South America and North America and from the South China Sea. Might that then moderate the high revenue that we all pay for Mideast oil right now, and then rebalance the economies in a constructive way? So, but again, by 2020, the keys that impact policy more than anything else are global economics. The other risk will be has nuclear weapons technology proliferated? And so what is the concern that a third party acquires a weapon from a new nuclear country that does not master the lock and key? So those kinds of things.
Thank you very much. Let me make one very important announcement. If you have arranged for lunch, you must pick up a card on an outside table. We do not want you to leave Washington hungry and get a bad impression of our city. So please pick up your lunch cards when you leave this room. Let me thank the panelists. Let me thank you for the participation in this event, and have a good time in Washington.